All right, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to all of our viewers all across the world. Welcome back to our second session of our conference today on unpacking the security and regional diplomacy in the Horn of Africa, building and empowering Somali resilience. In this session, you will hear from international experts on the political situation in Somalia and the current tumultuous political, economic, and security pathways, while also highlighting its diplomatic efforts across the Horn of Africa to deepen economic, national security cooperation and uphold participation in multilateral regional diplomacy. In this session, each panelist will make their 5 to 7 minute remarks on the topic, and then we'll conclude our program with a question and answer session. Welcome again, everyone. My name is Ahmed. I am the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the American Counterterrorism Targeting and Resilience Institute, ACTRI. I want to give a major shout out and thanks to all of our participants and also all of our viewers who are tuning into this very important program and conference today. And also Dr. Allison, who is working behind the scenes and making sure that our program is going smoothly today. She serves as our director, deputy director. Without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker of the program today, President Sheikh Sharif Ahmed. I will quickly read his bio, and let me say that all of the bios today are going to be very short. They don't do justice to our distinguished panelists, but you will find their full bios online. President Sheikh Sharif, also known as the father of the modern Somalia because of his achievements when he served as president of the transitional federal government between 2009 and 2012. President Sharif was the 7th president of Somalia and successfully brought the federal government of Somalia through the transitional status following the collapse of the previous government administration in 1991. President Sheikh Sharif, thank you for joining us, and the stage is yours. You are on mute. President Sharif, I don't think we are able to see your image. And whenever you're ready, we're ready for your comments. Okay, understanding that there is some technical difficulties, President Sharif will be back to us. Let me move on to Ambassador, I should say, Stephen Schwartz. Ambassador Schwartz, in his 31-year career in government, ended in 2016 when he was appointed as the first U.S. ambassador to Somalia in 1991. Since his retirement in 2016, Mr. Schwartz has served frequently as a foreign policy expert and U.S. military training events and a guest speaker on Somalia and other international platforms on international relations. Ambassador Schwartz is also a proud member of our ACTRI Research Advisory Board. Ambassador Schwartz, stage is yours.
Thank you, Mohammed, and thanks to RDN and Allison and ACTRI for this timely panel discussion. I think the situation in Somalia today is pretty dire, and it's very concerning. I try to follow it from afar. I talk with a lot of people. Everything that I'm hearing, everything that I'm reading points to a situation of a country in crisis. The electoral process is stuck. There is no consensus on a legitimate way forward. Internally, the divisions between the federal level and some of the member states are, again, in crisis. I think the international arena has been, in a sense, played to Farmajo's advantage, but not to Somalia's. I think this panel was supposed to cover the regional issues. I'll go into that a little bit more, and they do align in a way. I mean, I think one of the central problems of President Farmajo's administration has been his desire to have the much greater hand relative to the federal member states, and his unwillingness to consult with them, negotiate with them, and compromise with them. He has sought rather to control and undermine them, which has left the country over the last 3.5 years unable to address major issues successfully. How this has played into the international sphere is in many ways. I mean, for example, if you look at the Gulf crisis, where when this broke in, I think it was June of 2017, I was out as ambassador, and at the time, it came about suddenly, and I thought that the president at the time took a courageous and possibly correct position of trying to remain neutral and withstand pressure from UAE in particular to publicly align with UAE and Saudi Arabia against Qatar. Over time, what's happened is that they've become completely aligned, if not dependent upon Qatar, for reportedly large amounts of money coming in unaccountable, used to support the president and his administration. UAE is completely on the outs, although I think still is working with some of the member states as they did before. So the president has supported his position by aligning with Qatar. Conveniently, Turkey has had a longstanding, I think, positive relationship with Somalia, but underscoring Turkey's approach to Somalia has been to boost the federal government, irrespective of who is president. It's more of a philosophical position rather than a personal one, which I think it might be with Qatar. In the Horn of Africa, the president, I think, has acted to weaken relations with Kenya, a very important neighbor, in a way that's rather dramatic and dangerous. And even in the past week, where he has broken relations and he has troops in Ghetto, supposedly to control the border with Kenya, more to, I think, control part of Jubaland and weaken President Madobe's hold. But so the situation with Kenya is very bad. With Ethiopia, it improved with President Abe, Prime Minister Abe, who shifted Ethiopia's position a bit from supporting member states to more support for the federal government, which suited Farmajo. And he created, or was part of this alliance with Ethiopia and Eritrea. Now, Eritrea, it's not a democratic state, it's a repressive state. It's still not rejoining IGAD, and it doesn't appear to offer Somalia very much as a country, except possibly some, training for security forces and things like that, which again would advantage President Farmajo. And unfortunately, by having these closer relations with Eritrea, he has overlooked, and to some extent maybe disrespected, Djibouti, a longstanding majority Somali partner nation of Somalia. And that one's a bit hard to understand. So in all of these cases, he has aligned the country's international relations to support his position and the federal government. But I'm not sure that in many cases, particularly with Qatar, that it's very sustainable past a Formaggio administration. So, I think I'll stop there and let some other folks take over and answer questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador Schwartz, for your comments. Next, I would like to call Faisal Roble. Faisal Roble is the Chief Equity Officer for the City of Los Angeles Planning Department. Currently, Faisal manages citywide policies and programs related to housing, mobility, and the development of the transit-oriented districts, overseeing 1/3 of the city, which is over 1.2 million residents. He has completed the city councils adopted 2 of the largest projects in the history of the city, the USC Campus Master's Plan and the Jordan Downs Specific Plan, which together represents over 1.5 billion in investment into the local economy in Los Angeles and up in creating more than 15,000 jobs. Additionally, Faisal is one of the most influential Somali people in the Horn of Africa and in the United States. He's an expert and a frequent commentator on Somali issues and the larger Horn of Africa issues, as well as the former managing editor of Warder News. Mr. Faisal, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Muhammad, and I thank every panelist here and welcome them to this important discussion. Security and regional diplomacy for Somalia is really a very important subject, so I will just divide the topic into 2 parts: the underlying factors for Somalia's inability to secure its security sector, and then the immediate factors that which this ambassador eloquently addressed some of the issues there. As we discuss Somalia, I think we never remiss the 1991 civil war, which really left a disastrous political landscape for Somalia, and the aftermath is what we are dealing with. In that protracted civil war, whose vestiges are still with us, we lost some key values that were basis for the Somali concept for Somalia's state. We lost that, I don't know if it was fictional, but at least that concept of Somalia is a homogeneous society that's no longer there, and neither it's a reality. We also lost the concept of the mandek, the lactating she-camel, that we all expected to equitably distribute its milk so that we can really enjoy what state offers. Instead, we established a zero-sum game-based, clan-based state since that civil war, and really lost, if you will, the entire concept of the state securing legitimacy and also the peace of the citizen. I will not go deep into the negative impacts of the 4.5 system that we established after the collapse of the previous Somali Republic, but we are at a stage, and the ambassador probably touched in a very indirect way, but we are at a stage where we choose parliamentarians, professionals, even defense personnel, not on the basis of expertise and ability that they can do, but on the basis of this 4.5 and allocation of clan. At times, at the expense of expertise. A good example is today, we have sent our ambassador, the last ambassador, to Djibouti, and I don't think the person, without going into individual, would exploit the richness that IGAD maintains for Somalia, Djibouti being the headquarters for IGAD. This is a commonplace in Somalia today, where the people who are supposed to bring back they state that Somalia lost, are not in a position that they can do. State is a craftsman's issue. You craft a state, you craft policies, you craft security. And I don't think we have that craftsmanship playing role in Somalia. So that's one of the underlying factors of why the security sector of Somalia is not picking up the way we want. Poverty is another example, another issue that is really weighing heavily on the lack of secure state and secure country in Somalia. I just highlight some of the issues that was raised by the Brookings Institution, is a small but very innovative article written some time ago, which really traces back Somalia from its independence in 1960 to where it is today, statistically speaking. That Somalia is one of 3 countries that have fallen below what it was in 1960, not only in terms of expectations, and that is what I said about the lactating she-camel that our poetry eloquently expressed when independence came. But in terms of, income generating, GDP, everything, when time is factored in, Somalia is one of 3 countries that have fallen way back. You cannot have a secure sector, you cannot have a secure state and secure country where poverty is at 69 to 70% rate, where income has been going down. In addition to that, Somalia is one of the few countries that is still suffering from large number of displaced people and refugees, and those camps established for refugees and displaced persons are really, if you will, recruiting grounds for anti-security and anti-stability. So whether it's in Kenya or in Mogadishu, the large numbers of youth just stuck, not only because of unemployment, but the fact that they are in refugee camps and camps is also a heavy weight on our security sector in Somalia. Some of the immediate factors that I like to really touch quickly is the conflict between Somali federal government and the Somali federal states, as the ambassador touched. This is a very nagging issue that has been really resilient, if you will, that will not go away. And the reason why it doesn't go away is, in my opinion, despite the federal constitution that was drafted about 20 years ago and never ratified, although it was enacted and adapted in 2012, is the fact that the federal government really never divorced itself from the concept of a unitary system. So you have a system where the constitution speaks of a federal system where power is shared horizontally as well as vertically, but you have Villa Somalia, irrespective of who is the president, whether it was during the Sharif Hassan, President Hassan, or even for that matter, the president who is with us, or even more so under President Mohamed Abdullah Farmajo. Really, the concept of sharing power along constitutional lines is never respected. And that is the roots of the conflict between member states and the federal government. And more so with the case of Kismayo and Jubaland, simply because of the fact that the president has vested interests, particularly President Farmajo, although President Hassan himself had his own issues with Jubaland at the time. But in Farmajo's case, it has really hit the roof and it's become uncontrollable in a way. And the whole issue of the federal member states vis-a-vis the federal government is really one of the issues that I consider to be the immediate factors that are derailing the security issue of the country, which really gives me a chance to highlight a couple of points of diplomacy, because the problem with Jubaland also lends itself to some challenges with respect to relationship between Somalia and Kenya. And Somalia is in a very conundrum situation when you look at it at the diplomacy issue. It is fate and its future is in the hands of 2 states, Kenya and Somalia and Ethiopia, both of which have their own historical issues with Somalia. It would be a naivete by any commentator to think that Ethiopia/Kenya would try to wish great things for Somalia or greater constitution of the Somali state that we have lost. They may want to keep Somalia at a marginal level. Mallas Zenawi was a case, even particularly Abiy, who in my opinion is more Pax Ethiopiana than Mallas Zenawi, may even put in a darker hole, into a darker hole when it comes to Farmajo and Somalia. He may not know that, but as a student of Ethiopia, as somebody who grew up in my formative years in the Ogaden region, it is really a pipe dream for any Somali politician to think that Ethiopia would be a savior, which is where we are currently, which is the game that Farmajo seems to be playing. Now, with that immediate factor complicating Somalia's diplomacy and the fact that these two frontline states are really shaping the comeback of Somalia, or thinking that they will shape the comeback of Somalia, in my opinion, sometimes they perpetuate Al-Shabaab, they perpetuate the terrorist culture that we seem to have been stuck. So let me just quickly throw a couple of anecdotal things that I think may help. I think we need to open gradual talks, if possible, with Al-Shabaab, with a very serious conservation being kept, because Al-Shabaab is almost, if you will, 30 years old, although it mutated. I mean, Al-Shabaab traces its existence all the way back to Al-Ittihad, which started in 1991 in the Ogaden region, and it mutated, and today you have Al-Shabaab, which is armed. We haven't defeated. It's very difficult to defeat from what I see. The international forces cannot defeat. The Somali forces are not in a position where they can defeat. So if the United States was able to talk to the people who did the 9/11, there's no reason why Somalis cannot talk to Al-Shabaab. I think the federal government has to also ease its pressure on Madobe and really not destroy that region because Farmajo wants to empower some of his own particular gurus in the area. And three, I think we need to strengthen and integrate the existing Somali forces from Puntland all the way to Jubaland and come up instead of depending with US drones and what have you. I think it's about time that we take seriously, and the international community invests in reconstituting a national army that doesn't only draw on Mogadishu and its environs, but integrate the whole thing. Now, with respect to how do we mitigate Al-Shabaab returnees and what have you, I just will draw on a quick example that we have had in Los Angeles City. At one time, we had 75,000 armed gangs, bloody armed gangs in Los Angeles. And what we did was, after we established a gang office, we tried to link some of the social services that the government provides to the youth with the gang system, i.e. we have to link the returnees of Al-Shabaab and the youth with services such as housing, such as training for jobs, and also even to a point of investing in assigning case workers, whether those case workers are social case workers or even probation officers type thing, so that they can follow up. What's happening now, and the problem with Al-Shabaab is they come back, we let them go wherever they do, so they are still subject to be recruited to that trade that they have known in the future. So I think it's about time not only to invest in the military aspect of the security sector, but in the social aspect of the security system as part of the mitigation. And I will stop here and just pick up later on from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Faisal, for your very informative comments and remarks. Now I want to invite our next speaker, Ambassador David Shin. Ambassador David Shin is an American diplomat and a professor of international affairs at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. His diverse career in foreign service in the United States has included ambassadorships to Ethiopia and Burkina Faso. Ambassador Sen is also a frequent commentator in the news media on political issues and has provided consultancy to the U.S. government on the Horn of Africa related matters. Ambassador Shen, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Ambassador Schwartz began by noting that the situation in Somalia today is dire, and I agree with that. But I think it's also important to put it in perspective. My initial engagement with Somalia goes back to the early 1960s when I wrote my master's thesis on the Pan-Somali movement. By 1969, I had become the desk officer in the State Department for Somalia. And by the early 1990s, I was the State Department coordinator for Somalia during the international intervention in Somalia. As I look back over time, I'll bet I can identify 12 different occasions when I would describe the situation in Somalia as dire. We just happen to be in a new one now. When you go all the way back to the beginning, to the early 60s, I can recall referring to Somalia as a pastoral democracy, which I think it was at the time. And it's come a long way since those early days in the 60s. But let me go very much to the current situation. And I realize that I'm simply reiterating a couple of points that Ambassador Schwartz already made, but I'll elaborate on them slightly. Somalia's relations with its neighbors and other countries in the Red Sea region have become increasingly complicated in recent years. And the situation with Kenya is a particular point of concern at the moment. Following a recent visit to Nairobi by Somaliland President Musa Bihi, Kenya broke, as you know, diplomatic relations with Ethiopia, or Somalia was, I think, the protagonist in this case. Kenya still has some 3,600 troops located in Jubaland as part of the Amazon force, although it was actually making plans to remove that force from Somalia during 2021. Somali President Farmajo has now threatened to expel the Kenyan forces and indicated that he wants them replaced by Eritrean forces. But under the terms of the agreement that governs Amazon's troop contributing countries, the Somali government does not have the authority to remove a participating military force. And in any event, the situation is further complicated because Jubaland President Ahmed has close ties with Kenya and strained relations with Somali President Farmajo. Somalia is concerned that Kenya might strike a separate deal with President Madobe to secure its border with Somalia. Somalia also has a long-standing territorial dispute with Kenya over their maritime boundary. That is before the International Court of Justice today. Public hearings on the case have been postponed again, now until March of 2021. Kenya and Ethiopia have long disagreed over the best way for Somalia to move forward. Ethiopia has about 4,000 troops in Somalia under AMISOM, and an even larger number that are stationed there on a bilateral basis. The recent outbreak of conflict in Tigray region of Ethiopia caused the Ethiopian government to remove a small number of its troops from the bilateral contingent and return them to Ethiopia. It then disarmed some 200 to 300 Tigrayans who were part of the AMISOM force and confined them to quarters, thus weakening the force structure of the Ethiopian contingent assigned to AMISOM. Now, all of this has happened as the Trump administration announced that it is pulling its force of 700 out of Somalia, relocating them presumably to Kenya and Djibouti. Most of them, as you know, were training the elite Somali Danab force. Some were engaged in special operations against al-Shabaab. And these developments are obviously good news for al-Shabaab, but they also put additional strain on Somali central government forces. All of this is happening in the run-up to parliamentary elections in Somalia and presidential elections, and during machinations by the Gulf states and Turkey, all of whom are pursuing their own national interest vis-a-vis the government in Mogadishu and the different federal states in Somalia. While the major powers, the United States, the European countries, China, and Russia, mostly want political stability in Somalia, you have different ideas on how to achieve that stability and varying degrees of interaction with the different political forces in Somalia. Like the Gulf states and Somalia's neighbors, they too are pursuing their own interests. The internal political divisions in Somalia obviously make it easier for other states to use these divisions for their own purposes. And I think my parting remark is that until the internal political situation in Somalia can become more coherent and more unified, you're going to continue to have all of these outside players messing around for their own reasons and their own purposes, sometimes helping what is happening in Somalia, but oftentimes not. And I think the focus really needs to be upon internal political stability in the country. I look forward to taking questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Shen. And now I want to go back to President Sheikh Sharif Ahmed. Once again, President Sharif was the 7th president of Somalia and has successfully brought the federal government of Somalia through its transitional status following the collapse of the Somali government in 1991. President Sharif, the stage is yours.
Greeting to you all, Excellencies, esteemed guests and friends. It is a pleasure to be here with you all. I would like to thank Mohammed and the American Counterterrorism Resilient Institute. I would like also to thank the panelists, U.S. ambassadors, Schwartz and Sheikh, Mr. Zimmerman, Faisal Roble, and Abdullah Bashir. I would like to briefly share with you my observation on the challenges we are facing in Somalia. Firstly, the failure to manage internal conflict and the continuation of dialogue and reconciliation. Growing danger of the surgency of cross-border terrorism. Disruption of the development process, increasing poverty, unemployment rates, as well as limited investment flowing from the abroad due to security problems. Increasing migration rates from the country to abroad due to lack of stability. The recklessness of the authority, increasing confidence, its relations with political and societal forces. Now, there are clear process of circumventing the electoral process without regard for the democratic standards and the peaceful transfer of power. It is something that we worked on consolidate during the last period of our rule, appointing members of the security services or affiliate with the current authority with the bodies supervising the management of the electoral process. Danger of the spread of tyranny and the use of excessive violence excessive forces and the use of security services to restrict political opinions, arrest different political opinions, and exclude opponents from the working in state of institutions. Favorism of appoint relatives and the close individuals without concern for the competence and experience, an indication of widespread corruption in a state of institutions, creating turmoil with neighboring countries, Kenya as a model, the problem of engaging in regional excesses and bringing internal interventions. Poor and corrupted judiciary system often lead to people to seek justice elsewhere. Judiciary who cannot stay impartially willing to accept bribes and the ruling among client lines. We currently have incompetent institutions that clearly cannot function the way it is designed to. So my suggestion is priority to reconciliation, dialogue, strengthen relations, creating confidence, friendly environment between the components of Somali societies. The backbone of our development in Somalia are people, therefore, we must take care of them. The institutions must fulfill their duties in security, insecure individuals with capacity to honor the work. We need our institutions to be professional, fully functioning, and transparent, emphasizing the concept of governance, quality, transparency, integrity, and fighting corruption in the state organs. To focus on the issue of women and giving them full opportunities for positive engagement in the public life. Fight terrorism, combat extremism, and reject hate speech, and work to strengthen civil and community pieces. Free and fair election accepted by the people and in accordance with international recognized standards. Strengthening the concept of national partnership with all political forces. Consider the civil society organizations as the fundamental pillar in the building the new Somalia, adopting the slogan Somalia for its all people. Giving undivided attention to the youth sector, which makes up 73% of society, supported education, universities, and created job opportunities. Protecting human rights freedom in accordance with the international treaties and the Somali federal human rights law. The respect of freedom of expression and the information and the protection of the free press. There must be cohesion between the federal member states and the federal government, contributing building an equal regional system and not entering into any excess harming Somalia and the regional society. Restore Somalia's external relations on the basis of common interest and the focus on relation based on Somalia benefiting from the experience and the developed countries and the free societies. And lastly, we must establish a judiciary system which provides justice. The system must be one that public trust, be respectful and free from the corruption, tribalism, nepotism and bribery. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President, for your comments. Appreciate it. And now we're going to go to our next speaker, Mr. Abdullah Bashir. Abdullah Bashir is a researcher of leadership and policy. He is currently the executive director at the Center for African Immigrants and Refugee Organizations and a member of the Somali American Public Affairs Council. Mr. Abdullah, the stage is yours. You are on mute.
Thank you, Mr. Mohammed. Good evening, afternoon, or morning, depending on wherever you are. Thank you to ACTRI for putting together this amazing conference and panelists. What an honor to be in the company of long and distinguished career diplomats and public service leaders and professionals. Much of what I really would have said was already put forth by those that have spoken before me. But allow me to speak, if you may, about the drivers and dynamics of the conflicts in the region, especially those that in which Somalia is at the periphery of or at the center end. I'm not going to go into the details of solutions here, but rather broadly speak to about the categories of what I think is the source of conflicts in Somalia. Number one, I think I would say is internal drivers, and two is what I called external drivers. Like I said, for the sake of time, out of respect for time for all of you, I would not be proposing solutions to any of these categories. Also, this is not an exhaustive list, and what might therefore expand on them and as they deem fit. The main driver, the main internal driver of conflict in Somalia for Somalis is actually the new foreign concept of federalism itself. My colleague Faisal, I think, has written a lot about that. But the problem also lies in the comprehension of that system itself, both among the elites as well as the general populace of the Somali people. To the general public, the federal member state is merely viewed as a tribal enclave in which major clans accumulate resources and concentrate power for themselves. To the leader of a regional state, or should I say president, federalism means an opportunity to deal with foreign governments and be involved in bilateral relations in which the federal government is not privy of, or even to the disapproval of the federal government of Somalia. To the leader of the federal government, it means every means possible, an attempt to centralize power and resources, especially the political and economic resources, may I say. So unless there's a common understanding and agreement, therefore, of this model of governance, the type of it, the Somalis will always be in an internal conflict with itself and possibly with its neighbors. The lack of competent leaders and honest leadership that really understands the terrain and context of Somalia, that is willing and has the ability to pull people together. Until we find that, I think that internal conflicts would continue perpetually. Somalia has gone through some painful experience, and the most challenging task, therefore, would be sewing together the social fabric, the trust fabric that collapsed after the civil war in Somalia. We need leaders that can govern with constitutional justice across all Somalia. The second category, and maybe more dangerous drivers of Somalia's conflict, is what I call the external sources. I want to begin by questioning the effectiveness of AMISOM troops, for example. I recognize and commend the tremendous sacrifices and hard work of AMISOM troops in Somalia from all the participating countries. I, however, do question the membership of the countries that are part of Kenya. My colleague Faisal, I think, alluded to Kenya and Ethiopia not willingly, they're not in love of the country Somalia. I cannot agree more on that. And so, therefore, I question the membership of the countries on the borders of Somalia. And to name those, Kenya, Djibouti, and Ethiopia should never have been part of this AMISOM contingency in Somalia. That is a conflict of interest for me. And there's numerous examples to prove that. To make matters worse, some of these countries have actually forcefully entered into Somalia, even without the legal mechanisms to do so. And a good example of that was in Kenya when they forcefully entered Somalia in 2011 at the displeasure of the then commander-in-chief, President Sheikh, Sharif here. The AMISOM project, therefore, in my view, had been a cash cow for these countries with little to no returns in eradicating al-Shabaab. We cannot talk about security in Somalia without talking about al-Shabaab. We cannot talk about al-Shabaab without talking about AMISOM effectiveness in Somalia. It's even more painful that the West continues to fund this operation with no question about its effectiveness or dollar return, which brings me to the second type of external conflicts, in my view, and that is the dependence on the West and on the Arab coffers. Majority of the West's investment in Somalia is primarily driven by the urge to contain the threat of terrorism and the need for regional influence. The Arabs, driven by the need for geopolitical influence at best, or Somalia's destruction at worst, are buying out the Somali elites with cash money on every election cycle. Both of these groups unfortunately maintain their presence or influence through a cadre of greedy politicians and at the expense of Somalia's institutional capacity growth and demise of Somalia as we know it. Finally, and on another note, I am not the only Somali American who's concerned about the recent developments in the region between Somalia and Kenya, as well as the conflict and displacement in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. Yes, I agree with the ambassadors. Somalia is at crossroads. Of particular concern to the Somalis and possibly Kenyans is the ongoing diplomatic row between Somalia and Kenya. Over the last quarter of a century, Kenya has hosted a significant number of Somali refugees and had contributed to the liberation of some areas in the lower Juba corridor. While some may argue that Kenya was obligated or benefited from both these scenarios, I also want to recognize and acknowledge on the goodwill of the Kenya and its people. On the other side, and for the same amount of period, Kenyans formed the majority of expatriates in Somalia. They have therefore called Somalia home. Earnings from exports to Somalia had been in the double digits and in billion Kenyan shillings. Similarly, there are multi-million-dollar foreign direct investments in Kenya by Somali nationals. Therefore, a stable and prosperous Somalia is thus in the interest of not just Kenya, but for the entire region in the Horn. Kenya should not use the long-standing maritime case at the Hague-based International Court of Justice, ICJ, as a pretext to justify in its interference of Somalia's internal affairs. Equally, Somalia should acknowledge and appreciate the long-standing good neighborly relations that we've had in Kenya. Both parties should resume talks and amicably resolve their difference through diplomatic channels while leaving the maritime case to the ICJ. There are much more things that we share, that we Somalis share with Kenya, that we can possibly be involved in a fight with them at this time. And the same goes for Kenya. Thank you once again. I look forward to involving in the questions. Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you, Bashir, for your comments and insights. Now I want to invite our next speaker, Catherine Zimmerman. Ms. Catherine Zimmerman is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and an advisor to its Critical Threats Project. Her work focuses on Salafi jihadi movements with expertise on the global Al-Qaeda network, as well as related trends in the Middle East and Africa. She also specializes in Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Yemen, and Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and Al-Qaeda in the Sahel region. Ms. Zimmerman helped create and then directed the research for CTPS, Open Sources Intelligence, for a team of more than 15 staff and interns. Ms. Zimmerman is a well-known U.S. expert on Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, and all forms of extremism. Ms. Catherine Zimmerman, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here today, and frankly difficult following such a great list of panelists. So I wanted to keep my remarks short, but really focus on the area that is my expertise, which is on Al-Shabaab and the security situation regarding counterterrorism. And the top line challenge with the fight against al-Shabaab, which you've heard other panelists touch on, is how the local Somali and the regional political dynamics are affecting the security forces that are aligned against al-Shabaab, the group, and also how al-Shabaab is able to exploit some of the local governance gaps and frankly, security vacuum in places to gain strength on the ground. So, if you look at how al-Shabaab has evolved over the years, I'm not going to take us back through all of it, but the top line shift has been that al-Shabaab has grown from a Somalia-oriented group into an al-Qaeda franchise that is trying to be East African in nature, and then also is now aspiring to attack the United States. So in terms of terror threat, this is a group that has morphed from local objectives into global objectives, even if it doesn't have the capacity yet. The challenge that I've seen has been the primary focus on combating al-Shabaab has been in the security space and taking back the control of terrain. So this was the reason given by Kenya and Ethiopia for their interventions in 2011, 2012, before they formally became part of the Amazon mission to kind of push back on al-Shabaab, which was expanding into their territories. And what we've seen has been the recapturing of terrain without actually solving the political issues that allowed al-Shabaab to establish itself in the first place has not been able to weaken the group, either because the ongoing political dynamics mean that the forces that are taking the terrain back from al-Shabaab are then embroiled in local dynamics about who controls what, and so the unification behind those forces breaks up, or al-Shabaab is able to simply come back because they're not able to actually hold and govern the terrain. The second point that I really want to hit on is how these forces have been politicized. I'm not going to rehash what we've just heard. Certainly the Somali-Kenyan tensions in Jubaland are significant, and I am very concerned for how al-Shabaab is going to exploit the tensions going forward. We've watched al-Shabaab conduct specific attacks against Amazon contingents and bases, knowing that they will be able to hit the seam between the troop contributing countries to Amazon. The fact that redeployments are not, or reinforcements are based within the country contingent rather than across the entire force. And I'm very concerned to see the allegations that there are new Somali National Army troops moving down into the Geta region, because I don't think that has anything to do with the counterterrorism fight and has much more to do with tension between Mogadishu and Nairobi, and that will be played out inside of Jubaland rather than actually combating al-Shabaab. Certainly as we're looking at the dynamics in the region, Ethiopia and the crisis in the Tigray region is affecting the counterterrorism fight inside of Somalia. There are reports that Ethiopia has withdrawn some of its troops, not the Amazon contingent, but the ones present in Somalia outside of the Amazon deployment. And then the intra-Ethiopian fighting has affected some of the troops inside of Somalia. So there are reports that some of the Tigrayan fighters have been pushed back against by other Ethiopians, which again is shifting the focus of these forces from their mission, which is counter al-Shabaab and providing security, to another more politicized dynamic. And then of course the third bit, which is touched on with the Jubaland question and Ahmed Madobi's rule, but really the balance between the federal member states and the federal government of Somalia, who controls what and who has the authority. We've seen that Mogadishu is looking to declare itself to be sovereign and control over all of Somalia, but it doesn't have the forces or frankly the legitimacy across the full country in order to do that. And in order to build its own strength, has moved out local administrations and power brokers that actually were legitimate in the region itself. So, I'm not one to comment on where that should fall, but the tensions are certainly creating spaces for al-Shabaab. And finally, just looking at the region itself, Certainly the news from the Pentagon here in the United States is concerning, with the US deciding to redeploy forces outside of Somalia. My biggest concern is the gap the partnership gap that leaves with the Somali security forces, because as we are well aware, the Arab Gulf states and Turkey are jockeying for influence inside of Somalia. Turkey has a very solid relationship with the Somali security forces now, has been providing training, and the UAE had been doing counterterrorism work, but that was affected by some of the Emirati maneuvers inside of Mogadishu. So my big concern is, as we've heard before, the kind of external meddling by the Gulf states and Turkey inside of Somali affairs, which is destabilizing as each try to jockey for influence. And the meddling, I would say now, from the region itself, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Djibouti, as they try to contain the Shabab threat inside of Somalia, and are doing so in ways that are not actually going to lead to a stable solution long-term for the Somali state. So with that, I just want to leave it and open up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And now we will move on to our last speaker of our program, Mr. Fatah Mohammed. Mr. Fatah is currently the co-founder and managing director of the Horn Security Group. Mr. Fatah had a distinguished career in U.S. government, where he developed and coordinated, analyzed and measured complex military security, counterterrorism, and countering violent extremism programs. In this capacity, he had led the efforts to develop strategies, plans, and initiatives impacting Africa and the Middle East, most notably efforts to counter violent extremism and extremist groups in the Horn of Africa and Yemen region as well. Mr. Fatah, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Mohammed, and thank you to ACTRI. Good afternoon and good evening to the distinguished guests. It's a pleasure to be involved in this webinar and virtual webinar. We're at a time of heightened political time in the US, and I think the same thing is going on in Somalia, especially with dealing with the issue of pandemic, security challenges. And to start, I am not as pessimistic about Somalia as I've heard earlier. To be honest with you, I've been traveling to Somalia for the better part of 15 years. I remember landing in Mogadishu at airstrips controlled by militias, to now at least some functioning government and administration at all levels, from federal, state, from federal down to the local level. So there are formation of state, and things are progressing for the average Somali. But the issue is political. And we are at a heightened political time. Somalia is heading for an election, so that you're going to see a lot of talk and a lot of jockeying for positioning, and also a lot of allegations of internal involvement of neighboring countries in Somalia's political affairs. And that is expected. Of course, Somalia for about 3 decades been dealing with proxy agents and governments using Somalis as proxies, whether they're federal government or federal member state government. So that's something that's been part of the culture for the past 20, 30 years. So I think things will progress. I think there's going to be election in 2021. It will take some time to sort it out, but I think there will be at least a parliament and an election, and whether Farmaajo is reelected or not, or whether there's a new president, that's something to be determined. But I'm more optimistic than pessimistic about Somalia and the outlook for Somalia. When it comes to the issue of the security, I think the U.S. military withdrawal from Somalia raises risks not only to the Somali citizens, but also to Americans. I think this undermines of almost 2 decades of policy that work to strengthen regional and local security forces. And we are U.S. is pulling its forces out of Somalia at a critical time when Al-Shabaab is losing. Al-Shabaab is not militarily defeated, but Al-Shabaab is less capable today than they have been in the last decade. A lot of that you can look at data showing that Al-Shabaab's attacks against civilian targets has decreased over the last 2 years. The kinetic strikes targeting Al-Shabaab leaders, structures, command and control have been effective. Al-Shabaab has been pushed out of many areas in Lower Shabelle and Middle Shabelle, and they're now moving to Galmudug and also to Juba region, away from population centers. So all of that is happening, was happening, and suddenly we have this military decision made by the administration to pull the forces out. So I hope that the new administration will at least reconsider the decision and at least move forward in a way that will augment the Somali security forces and contribute to the success that they've been having against Al-Shabaab in the counterterrorism operations. I am not as optimistic about the African Union mission in Somalia, especially the contributing countries. And I think that the African Union mission is no longer viable. I think it costs too much and it doesn't do what is required. Decisions are not made by the commanders, but it's made by from the capitals of contributing countries. So, we all, honor and respect the work that they've done and sacrifices these governments have made to bring Somalia to this position. However, over the last 3 years or 4 years, or even longer, the effectiveness of Amazon forces have decreased. And we're seeing that their contribution to the counterterrorism operations has not really been, what you will expect from a force of 20,000. So we're seeing that as something that needs to be looked at. In terms of Al-Shabaab as an organization, Al-Shabaab is an Al-Qaeda affiliate, is a threat to US, it's a threat to Somalia, a threat to the region. And we have overlooked terrorist organizations before, and we paid heavy price. And we should never, go back to the mindset of pre-9/11 that, these are organizations that are local. Al-Qaeda was once upon a time an Afghanistan-based organization. ISIS was Iraq-based organization, and we saw what happened. So we should not overlook these organizations. But I think the focus should be on continuing to support the institution building in Somalia, facilitating dialogue between the federal government and the federal member states, contributing to the increasing the capabilities of Somali security forces to combat Al-Shabaab and also to secure the country, and also to allow Somalia and its neighbors to have the space to have bilateral and dialogue. What concerns me is that discussions between Somalia and Kenya become regional discussions. These are issues that Somalia and Kenya were able to resolve before, and I think they can resolve those issues without having other external actors involved. So that recently at the conference in Mogadishu, where the Somali government's position was in opposition to what some other countries were trying to do, which is to impose on Somalia and to tell them what needs to happen. Somalia, at the end of the day, we've been working, the international community, US, others have been working toward securing Somalia, building Somalia, as a state, and making sure Somalia has a sovereignty and territorial integrity that is respected. I think we should honor that. I think we should allow the government in Somalia, whether it's this government or future government, to have the space to have conversations with their neighbors and to continue that dialogue. I think when others are involved, that's when it becomes more problematic. And we saw that from the communique coming out of from IGAD and today, that they've avoided this issue and actually punted on the issue of Kenya-Somalia dialogue as an issue. In conclusion, I think there are political challenges facing Somalia. I think the Farmaajo administration has used Jubaland, especially the Geda region conflict, to paralyze the political process. I think the more they send forces to Jubaland, and especially to Geda region, the more that will lead to political paralysis, and that will discourage any dialogue between the federal government and federal member states, and that will delay elections and delay the process. So I think the pressure needs to be on the government to work with Jubaland and to facilitate dialogue between the two in order to get the political issues going forward. So I will leave it at that. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mohammed. And thank you to all of our guests for sharing their remarks. And now we're going to move on to the stage of our Q&A, question and answer sessions. For all of our participants, if you have direct questions, please address them in a very brief manner in the chat box. Let me begin with the first question, and this goes to Ambassador Schwartz, Catherine, and Mr. Mohammed as well. As you know, the American military presence in Somalia over the past decade has assisted the Somali government in its fight against Al-Shabaab and other terrorist groups in the country as well. as you are also aware, that the U.S. has recently announced that it will remove troops from Somalia. One, can this happen in the most sensitive time for Somalia? And what does it mean for the U.S. commitment in the region against the fight against al-Shabaab and terrorism?
I'll jump in. Yeah, I think the decision to withdraw or reposition U.S. troops from Somalia is unfortunate and untimely. I would agree. I believe it was done outside of any U.S. government policy or strategy with respect to Somalia or the Horn, but was the personal whim or desire of President Trump. Is something that I think he sees as some kind of achievement by getting U.S. forces out of what he would consider one of those endless wars or something. I would hope that since most of the forces, I believe, are going to be repositioned to Kenya and Djibouti, that many could be put back into Somalia soon after President Biden takes over. I'm not sure what kind of a process that would take, whether the military command, the AFRICOM commander, or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs have the authority on their own to reposition some into Somalia or not, or how quickly the Biden administration could address that. But I think the Biden administration should give a good look at Somalia. I'm not sure that we've got a high level approved policy on Somalia since 2012, which is the one that I was operating under. So it's overdue, and I think a lot of the people, including Tony Blinken, who are coming back, are people with long experience on Somalia policy. So it's a good opportunity, for that. I'll cut it there.
I can follow up on the ambassador's remarks. So I think the decision came from the push within the Pentagon to reduce the resources going toward counterterrorism. And while there's a lot of support for that within the counterterrorism community, because one, the US in particular has become more efficient and effective with its counterterrorism capabilities. And then two, the resources, there's a high demand on those resources for other more pressing national security interests. So the shift to a global power competition, for example. But the problem with the decision, and I have a piece that I hope comes out on this soon, is that it shifts us back into what Mohammed was talking about, which is just the pure counterterrorism fight against al-Shabaab, the targeting and the effort to move against it militarily, which my assessment has been effective, but it leaves a lot of space for the group to come back and transform. And there are concerns from my end about what that means, both in terms of the messaging to partners, both on the ground in Somalia and elsewhere for the United States, when we pull out so rapidly and frankly end a training program that wasn't quite culminated. And then two, the American ability to catch evolutions in al-Shabaab's capabilities. So I hosted Major General Dag Anderson, who's the commander for Special Forces Africa Command here at AEI in September. And what was alarming to hear him talk about was how the plot that al-Shabaab has been working on to hijack an airplane, the US literally stumbled upon that intelligence. So one of the things that we forget about is the link between presence, intelligence, and the ability to act. And so by removing the American presence, I think it will limit our ability to know exactly what's going on in some of the al-Shabaab sanctuaries, which, frankly, I don't see Somali or Amazon forces really taking back parts of the Shabelle regions for a long time. And there's going to be a black hole. So I have a lot of concerns about giving al-Shabaab back this space. And as Mohammed noted, kind of turning the momentum back over to the group to let it seize the opportunity.
Thank you, Catherine. And
Mohammed, may I add? I just want to add a quick thing, just a quick comment. I agree with both Ambassador Schwartz and Catherine about the I mean, the issue is, from my perspective, is how is this going to impact Al-Shabaab and ISIS? The U.S. has been carrying out kinetic strikes against Al-Shabaab operations in South Central Somalia, but also supporting Puntland security forces in their fight against ISIS in Bari region. So my concern is that the removal of U.S. forces will diminish U.S. and also Somali capabilities to combat these violent extremist groups. And this will boost Al-Shabaab and ISIS's morale and lead to them increasing their capabilities, recruiting more. And also, one of the things that the Somali government has done successfully over the last couple of years is actually dismantling checkpoints that Al-Shabaab used to raise funds and taxation. So that is going to come back. And my concern is that, especially in South Central Somalia, that you will see Al-Shabaab and allied militia, allied clans or whatever, start reestablishing checkpoints where they will collect taxes, and that will disrupt commerce and lead to even more, terrorism and problems for Somalia and the region.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mohammed. If I could, even get a Somali perspective on this, maybe to Mr. Roble. Given the presidential elections in Somalia that will take place in 2021, if they do take place, what is the potential impact of U.S. withdrawal?
Well, I think I'm glad you said Somali perspective. And in a nutshell, the Somalis view by far the attacks of the US drone as a negative thing. You rarely would find anybody who upholds and supports and sees this drone as a meaningful game changer. However, Somalis very much welcome the component of the US presence when it comes to training specialized troops that can combat Al-Shabaab. I think Al-Shabaab and both AMISOM has been sort of like tools for any politician, particularly for this current administration, to really capitalize on when they want to do their own machination and political, maneuvering. So a Somali perspective, as I said, would want to invest more and more in the training of Somali troops, and less respect is given to the drones, because as you see, the collateral damage is very high. The damage of the sorties that we usually conduct, the return is very small compared to the investment and to the duration. So Somalis in general do have positive perspective and positive look at the US all the way from a long time. If you remember, when Russia was in Somalia, Somalis always viewed US aspect, and US involvement more positive than the Russian because of their own nature. So I think I would like to emphasize, and although I have tremendous respect for the US watchfulness and overseas outlook when it comes to terrorism, but I think Al-Shabaab is more of a threat to Somalis by a big margin than it is to the US and to Americans. So although we have that, eye on what they can do to US tourists in Kenya, to US interests in Tanzania, and that's a small part. I think the big part and the big investment, in my opinion, as an American Somali, needs to be invested in enhancing the Somali capacity through US training to weaken Al-Shabaab. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that, the drone issue in Somalia definitely has been viewed, positively from a government perspective, but definitely from a civilian perspective, the loss of civilian lives who are caught in these drone attacks have, in many ways, also allowed people to join Al-Shabaab as well.
Mohammed, can I add just a quick thing? I totally understand the concern about kinetic operations against terrorist groups. But if you go back to 2017, 2018, and look at the horrific attacks that were taking place in Mogadishu, I was there when, for example, shortly after the October attack, when almost 600 people perished. I mean, there was really, as some people who are understand counterterrorism and security, the options are limited in combating Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab is is a government within a country that has a government. I mean, basically, Al-Shabaab controls territory. And one of the ways you can combat Al-Shabaab and dismantle, disrupt, defeat them is to go after their structures, to go after its leaders, and also to go after its financing. And the only way you can dismantle and defeat them, especially in places like Juba, Jubaland, Isako, Jilib, Jamame, all those areas where the group has strong presence, is to target surgical strikes. So I'm not saying that kinetic strikes don't cause civilian casualties. They do. But if you ask the Somali government, you ask the civilians in Mogadishu, they are much more comfortable seeing Al-Shabaab fighters and leaders killed than seeing civilians killed in Mogadishu. So I think there is more positive in terms of the contribution to the security of Mogadishu, security of Somalia from these operations, whether they're kinetic with other operations carried out by Somali security forces. Recently, if you look at some of the attacks that went after Al-Shabaab, was done by Somali special forces. And these are U.S. trained special forces that are regarded as some of the best trained forces in the region, and they've been going after Al-Shabaab. So I think there is a lot more, there needs to be some understanding that this is war. This is not, we're not talking about, political exercise or academia. People will die in wars, and in this case, unfortunately, civilians did die as a result of some of these strikes. But the return on that investment is that Somalia, especially in Mogadishu and other parts of the country, are much safer for the Somali citizens.
Great input. And if I just could have a follow-up on that, finances is also important. Supporting the Somali government from the military perspective is great, but understanding that Al-Shabaab is very effective in raising money. So what is the role of the larger international community in addressing this issue, whether revenues are coming from the cotton industry, from the charcoal industry, which is a lucrative business for Al-Shabaab? What is being done from an international perspective and a Somali government to combat its finances?
Do you want me to jump in?
Feel free, anyone.
I think it's the entire collapse of the Somali banking system and the replacement of that by Hawala is a very serious issue when it comes to financing Al-Shabaab and other terror groups. Most of the money that Al-Shabaab either receives from abroad or Al-Shabaab sends to its affiliates inside Mogadishu or other towns such as Bosaso, which is not, by the way, out of reach of Al-Shabaab, as I have learned recently in a recent visit to Bosaso. Unless you really do something about that whole Hawala system and the symbiotic relationship between the terrorist groups and this informal money banking system, I think Al-Shabaab will always have cash disposal, at its disposal. And I haven't seen any serious efforts, both by the Somali government as well as by international groups, to really de-link Al-Shabaab from its mechanics of transferring money internally as well as globally. And I think that needs to be attended as we go into our next phase.
Mohammed, one of the quick things I just want to add quickly is the issue of the law. What is the law? I mean, there's really, the parliament needs to pass counterterrorism laws and security laws in the country in order to go after the financing of Al-Shabaab and other extremist groups. So I think that's one area that the Somali parliament has fell short. And also the Somali government is the issue of judiciary and holding people accountable. This is, I mean, I advise on money laundering and terrorism financing issues, and it's a lot easier to identify and to go after. I'm confident that Al-Shabaab is not using the central bank or some of the major institutions, but they're using electronic virtual currencies, which is a lot easier to send. You're sending money using your phone, basically, and that's how they're able to collect taxes and distribute money across the country.
If I may add, Mohammed, speaking of legislations, I think what comes to mind is the telecommunication industry. They say Somalia, as one of the cheapest internet services, is rated best in the region for mobile financing. I think that has to do a lot with the regulations or lack of regulations thereof. It has taken, I think, long time to pass that through the parliament, but that wasn't enough. I think we have huge, gigantic corporations that are bigger than the government itself when it comes to funding, and unless we find a solution to tackle that as a problem, I think we will always have these financing issues. We've recently seen the report, I think, from somewhere that Al-Shabaab is collecting millions in revenues, and not necessarily in where they are physically, but also in places that you may not think they're there physically. So their business is virtual now. They can tax an Al-Shabaab commander in Jilib can tax business in Mogadishu or in Bosaso. So they also have to tackle that I think from the grassroots. So those two I think are big problems for me. The ability of Al-Shabaab to tax businesses no matter where, I mean in the entire country, and then very lax or lack of laws regarding telecommunication industry, especially around the mobile finance.
Thank you so much for your comments. Before we move on to regional issues such as Kenya and Ethiopia, I want to ask this question to Ambassador Schwartz and also Faisal Roble. As you know, the current Somali administration over the past few years had serious problems with its regional member states, particularly Jubaland and Puntland. In your opinion, what can be done to enhance reconciliation between the state administrations and the federal government?
Thank you. Great question. Leadership, first of all. The relations weren't bad because they have to be bad. They were bad, I think, because the federal government took sort of a hostile approach to federal member states. Jubaland and Puntland are maybe seen as most difficult because they're probably the most legitimate as member states. They actually have their own sources of funding. They have some administrative capability, and they can be more independent of Mogadishu than some of the others, which are more dependent. Maybe they don't have a port, or they just don't have governing capacity. The federal government could have taken a wholly different approach. The president could have worked on finalizing the national security architecture over the last 3.5 years to sort of figure out what level of government would be providing what level of security, what kind of security, and how would that be financed. More broadly, they could have made much more progress or finalized the Constitution, which would have laid out across the board the various responsibilities and authorities of different levels of government and the funding. They could have worked collaboratively. There could have been more revenue sharing from the federal government to the member states. You could have, I think, in exchange for some genuine and meaningful support from Mogadishu, you could have gotten the member states to cut back on their international dealings. UAE comes to mind. Kenya is a tougher one, but a lot of these things could have been managed through negotiation, through consultation, and that just didn't happen. That was not in the president's mind, and it wasn't in his style. And I think the country suffered for it. So that's what I would have recommended, to completely redo the relationships at the various levels. And I think it would have been a much more successful 4 years for Somalia.
Yeah, Mohammed, I totally agree with the ambassador's assessment on the situation. I will just highlight quickly 2 things with respect to Jubaland's challenge vis-a-vis the central government. I was in 2017 when that huge terrorist act took place in Mogadishu, and I went for the purpose of assembling the Constitutional Assembly for Jubaland, as well as the federal government and others. And I had an opportunity to have discussion with some of the key people that advised and worked for the previous president, Hassan Sheikh Mohamud. And being a critic at the time, of Hassani's government, especially on the issue of Jubaland, I had the chance to ask them and said, what happened? Why did you guys waste so much capital on Jubaland? And they admitted to me and they said, yes, we were wrong, but unfortunately we learned that we were wrong in the second or third year and then the last year of his administration, Hassan invested all his political power to resuscitate the Jubaland as a state, and that's one of his legacy. And what happened was, Farmacho, the day he came in up to this day, he never had an alternative approach to Jubaland except to destroy or fight with Ahmed Madobe. And that really took a lot of energy out of him. And, we are here where we are today. No resolution, and probably Ahmed Madobe would outlast him if he's not re-elected because he will be there and President Farmacho may not be. The other thing is the constitution, which both Abdul Qadir and the ambassador mentioned. I don't think there is a clear understanding of Somali politicians of the federal system that they theoretically accepted. As ambassador implied, the draft constitution only gives the federal government 4 areas of control, one of which is foreign affairs, money, defense, what have you. And there was an intent when this cut and paste constitution was drafted that they will come back and literally codify and also do the fiscal federalism, for which I participated several conferences in Addis and what have you, but no product to come out. So what you have today is a federal draft constitution that empowers the regions and only gives the federal government 4 areas to act on. And that really literally paralyzed the entire governance system of Somalia. So I think whatever comes out of the next election, whether Farmacho comes back or a new government comes in, I think the first thing that they need, among other things, is to really make this federal constitution a meaningful document that they can really revise and then make it a living document as they go. They can revise and add something. But the very constitution that they have is one that any president that takes Villa Somalia doesn't accept it the way it is today. So there is a need for revisiting that whole issue.
Thank you so much for your comments.
Mohammed?
If may I add a little bit, Mohammed, I think it always goes back to the issue of federalism and also constitution. If you look at the history of both the states that we're talking about, Puntland and Jubaland as well, they've never been in a bed of roses with the federal government before even this one. There's always been issues one after the other. And so I want to point that this is not the conflicts of Jubaland and Puntland with federal government. It's not renewed now. It's not something that's just happening with this government. We have seen that with President Hassan Sheikh's government and the one even before that in the case of Puntland. And I think unless we explicitly address and categorize the powers within the constitution with respect to federalism, this issue is going to keep happening. If you recall the elections, the local elections in Puntland and Jubaland, the federal government was not even allowed to be on ground. It took some time to convince Puntland government. In the case of Jubaland, they were never there. Now, ironically, they want to manage the federal elections. And so I think we may also look at the end of the other side of the coin here. And also look at, I think we need a hard look at what system that we have chosen. I think it's figurative for me, but then how do we define that? Can we do maybe a national census on this? That's actually do the people of Somalia actually support the federal government, the federal system as a governance model? If so, then what type do we need? And how do we ensure that we have that explicitly stated in the constitution that we have? And how do you actually complete that constitution? I think is the point of contention here.
Mohammed, I just want to add one thing. I think one of the biggest issues that we have not discussed is the issue of the dark money coming from the Gulf states and coming from other countries that is actually impacting Somalia. I think we're seeing the political process in Somalia corrupted by foreign forces, money coming from Gulf states and coming from the region. And we saw that in the elections in Puntland, where allies of the federal government received significant amount of money to run for president, to run for the parliament, where they lost. But we saw the federal government succeed in Hirshabelle, Galmudug, and in Southwest with their candidates winning the elections through corrupt practices, paying for vote. And this is something that is really corrosive and is undermining the rule of law, it's undermining democracy, it's undermining confidence in government in Somalia. As a Somali American, I mean, somebody who was born in Mogadishu, somebody who grew up in Somalia, it concerns me that I see members of parliament who have abdicated their responsibilities. If you look at the Somali parliament, they're called Golaha Saku because all they do is just they are clappers. You don't see them challenging the federal government actions. You don't see them challenging the encroachment that the Bill of Somalia has taken on some of the authorities that were reserved for the parliament. So those are the things that we need to look at. What is the role of the parliament? The federal parliament is supposed to represent the people. They elected the president. They approved a prime minister, but they have abdicated their responsibilities to Somali people. And if you look back on all the conflicts between the federal government and federal member states, the institution, the parliament, is missing from action.
Thank you, Mr. Mohammed. I think you touched upon a very important topic, which is the outside influence or the meddling within Somali politics from outside factors. Now I want to move on, and we'll get back to that point very soon as well. Now I want to move on to Ambassador Shin. You were the former ambassador to Ethiopia, and you know the region, the Horn of Africa, very well as well. So currently, Ethiopia is going through a civil war in its Tigray region. What is the regional implications if this civil war has in the Horn of Africa, and what can a destabilized Ethiopia really mean for the Horn of Africa?
Well, I think in the first instance, a destabilized Ethiopia is a very good news for al-Shabaab. All of you know the relationship between Somalia and Ethiopia. There's no need to revive that at all. It's obviously a very fraught relationship, goes back many decades. That's not going to change. At the moment, it's actually probably better than it's been in a long time. But that doesn't mean it's going to remain a relatively good relationship. The problem in Ethiopia today is already slopping over the borders of Ethiopia. I indicated at the outset the relatively small impact it has had upon Ethiopian troops that have been assigned to Somalia, either the disarming of the Tigrayan element or the removal of small numbers from the Ethiopian contingent in Somalia. It's had a greater impact upon the Eritrean relationship. Whether that plays out into Somalia or not remains to be seen. Conceivably, there could be implications for Somalia. I'm intrigued that Farmajo is talking about the possibility of Eritrean forces replacing Kenyan forces. That's probably not going to happen, but nevertheless, he has that in mind, apparently. And of course, you have refugee flows that have gone into Sudan, 50,000 plus, mainly Tigrayan refugees in Sudan today, and the numbers would be much higher, except that it appears that the central government forces in Ethiopia are preventing larger numbers from making it to Sudan. And I don't see any immediate end in sight for the situation in Tigray. The TPLF leadership has not been captured. It's still roaming about somewhere. The question remains as to whether the TPLF has the support of the Tigrayan people at this point. And that's a question I wish I knew the answer to. And I don't know how much support the TPLF has. If it has considerable support of the people, this situation in Tigray is going to go on for a long time. There will be no quick end to it. If the TPLF has lost or is losing support of the people, then it could conceivably come to a relatively quick end. But that will not solve the problems in Ethiopia. You have numerous other ethnic questions that are almost as serious as the one in Tigray, involving other parts of Ethiopia. They have simply been sublimated because the Tigray situation has taken all of the oxygen out of the air for the moment. But those other issues are going to come back to haunt Ethiopia sooner rather than later, which is going to raise other questions about the stability of Ethiopia. And all of this, I think, is bad for the region. I think a stable Ethiopia, ideally a benign Ethiopia in terms of its neighbors, but a stable Ethiopia is what is needed for the area. It is the keystone, if you will, to the Horn of Africa. And if you have an unstable Ethiopia, you're probably going to have an unstable Horn of Africa, meaning that virtually everyone is going to be impacted in one way or another.
Thank you very much. To our next question, so the next question will be to Ambassador Schwartz, Ambassador Shin, and Faisal Roble as well. As you know that, there are multiple challenges in the Horn of Africa, and one of the recent one is the diplomatic spat between Kenya and Somalia. When last week, Somalia has cut all diplomatic relations with the Kenyan government. So the question is, what can be done on both sides to calm the situation, and what does it mean for the region in terms of stability?
Muhammad, if I jump in and just say before that one quick word about Ethiopia's impact on Somalia. There is already 1 million, by estimate, 1 million Ethiopians who are already living and scattered in Somalia as displaced people. And I always equate that number with the total population of Djibouti, which is about less than 100,000. So already there are Ethiopians living in Somalia that are larger and bigger than Djibouti. And if this war continues, and you should understand that ACTRI has border with Afar region, and if the Tigray war doesn't get contained, then the impact could be both on Somalia and Djibouti. And as this morning, there are unconfirmed reports that Mallas's daughter has been arrested, and probably that will aggravate more Tigrayans, whether they were pro-TPLF or not. Having said that, I think the spat between Kenya and Somalia, in my opinion, and I opined this earlier, was the most unfortunate situation. The impact is big, in my opinion, if we don't arrest this. As you know, Somalis play a significant role in the Kenyan economy. Probably outside Somalia, Somali capital and Somali economy literally lives in Kenya, as opposed to, say, Ethiopia, where no Somali that I know has even a hotel or a small restaurant in Addis Ababa. Somalis don't go beyond Dredab for whatever reason. So Kenya has been a very accommodating country for Somalis outside the politics. With the latest fiasco, I think as much as I support and stand by Somalia's sovereignty, my feeling is Villa Somalia didn't follow several international instruments, and I have here two ambassadors who probably know more than I do, in terms of, cutting diplomatic relationship with a country that's so important. I mean, the Geneva Convention probably has its own layers and structures that one has to follow. The other thing is, I think Somalia never really defined why the abrupt diplomatic cut was done. As late as this morning, the new foreign minister has given a news report after he returned from Djibouti as to what happened, and he never mentioned Jubaland. He never mentioned Kenyan interference in Somali politics. He mentioned a numerous, never heard before information as to the cause why the diplomatic relationship was cut. And he said, Kenya is arming a new guerrilla group against Somalia, which was, when I searched that and went around, it's probably an internal clan situation now. So I think the impact that Kenyan relationship with Somalia on the region is not really positive. As I said, the economic relationship between the two is heavy. We have Somalis in Kenya, 2.5 million to 2.7 million Kenyan Somalis. And the long lived leader of the Kenyan independence movement, NFD, has been in the media as late as yesterday, literally warning Kenya to soften its edges and its stand toward the Somalia. Wago or somebody, his name is Bokor Wago. So I think if Kenyan-Somali relationship really gets out of hand, it will affect both. It will affect Somalia negatively, but definitely it will affect Kenya's NFD. So I think that needs to be treated very carefully with a soft hand.
You know, I don't pretend to know what Kenya's particular concerns and goals are with Somalia, but I think whatever they are, and many of the other things we've talked about could be addressed through much better governance in Somalia. Clearly, everybody, first and foremost, Somali people, are looking for a government authority in Somalia that's going to start to provide basic services, including security or justice and reconciliation and education and things. And it's not happening. And if there were collaborative relations between federal and member state level, in this case, Jubaland, if there were efforts to increase security and governance in the country, in this case, the Jubaland area, Kenya could be part of that. That's what their troops are doing there. They can be made a partner and not an enemy. As for the maritime boundary, it's with the ICJ, and that's fine. But as a diplomat, I wonder, well, is there not a diplomatic opportunity there? I have no idea who has a stronger legal case or no idea how the court will decide, but why wait for that, right? And why maybe a winner take all or something the parties are unhappy with? Why not? Why couldn't Formaggio offer Kenyatta some significant share and just divide it in some way where both sides save face and they can live as neighbors, forever. Who knows somebody could get cut out entirely, and then what are they gonna do? So I think there are a lot of ways to handle it, both in the sort of immediate sort of tactical diplomatic sense or longer term, just better governance, better relations, more collaboration.
Thank you, Ambassador Schwartz. And now I want to bring in Catherine for this question. It's a two-part question, and the second part goes to Abdullah Bashir. The first one is military intervention is one component when it comes to the fight against al-Shabaab or all terrorist organizations. But among the most impactful and effective tools has been the contribution of civil society. So my question is, what should be done to empower civil society's role in the fight against al-Shabaab? And the second question for Mr. Bashir is, we are seeing record numbers of Somali diaspora returning back to Somalia to help rebuild and to contribute to building a more stable Somalia. What is the impact of Somalia's diaspora in terms of peace, security, and diplomacy? And Catherine, go first.
Super, thank you. So that question is near and dear to my heart, since I've spent many years arguing against how particularly the United States has framed the fight against groups like al-Shabaab. We've framed it in a security framework, which means that our response tends to be from the military, intelligence, and law enforcement communities, and we've effectively trained our partners to do the same thing. So I point to Kenya as an example of a phenomenal counterterrorism partner that now has a bigger terrorism problem because the Kenyans haven't been able to address some of the underlying issues that have enabled al-Shabaab to recruit, even as we look at the difference between the Westgate attack in 2013 and the Dusit 2 attack in 2019 in terms of the security response. But in terms of combating al-Shabaab through civil society, I frankly don't know the tapestry of civil society organizations well inside of Somalia. But what I have seen largely has been that it's not just CSOs in terms of combating these groups. It's actually trying to compete with them in what they're offering. And that's where I think the Somali politicians writ large have fallen flat. Al-Shabaab has been able to offer stability, not, its officials are not corrupt or as corrupt as others. If you pay Al-Shabaab taxes once, you pay them once and you're done, versus if you're working with other officials, there's kind of a little cut over time. And I think that improved governance just hasn't come to Somalia, and it frankly hasn't been a focus of the Western nations that have put a significant number of resources into the country. We've been focused on the security side primarily, and it hasn't been a big focus, I think, for Somali officials, because there are a lot of incentives for them not to get that right, because they are cutting away their ability to make money for themselves, their clan, their patronage network. And so, you look at how we've incentivized the structures inside of Somalia in combating Al-Shabaab, and we've basically replicated or reinforced our own framing in the country. There are efforts now, I believe, to diversify, but security and governance go hand in hand. So it's not sufficient just to try to turn this over to civil society organizations, because we know very well that Al-Shabaab can enforce its own will in the territories that it holds. And so there needs to be some sort of hard power that comes along with the soft power approach. And I think that's fundamentally where we have gaps. So even as we're watching security forces actually take back terrain from Shabaab, we're not able to hold it because there's not a police force. There's not this idea that there's something that comes next. So I think it's a phenomenal question, and I really do hope that the international community writ large engages on it and tries to rebuild, I think, the frankly community resilience and local forms of governance that have broken down over 20 years of conflict, 30 years of conflict, excuse me, inside of Somalia.
Thank you, Catherine. Bashir, you're on mute. Okay.
Thank you. I think it's a great question that you asked, Mohammed. If I were to look at the role of Somali diaspora in state building, in Somalia rebuilding, I think we could best view that as a double-edged sword. On one hand, they continue to play a significant role in development, while on the other hand, they also have a controversial one. Let me state out loud that this is not unique to the Somali diaspora only. It has been and is done by other diasporic communities in the West. A recent example comes to mind, and that is to do with the regime change in neighboring Ethiopia. As you all know, that was a movement instigated by the Ethiopian diaspora, especially that of the Oromo community. That role and the resultant factors, for example, the Nobel Peace Prize award to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, as well as the recent clashes between the federal government of Ethiopia and that of the Tigray region. On a much positive role, however, also what I can recall is the Eritrean government, how they have successfully implemented a tax levy on the funds reimbursed by, sent by the Eritrean community here in the West. The Somali diaspora had historically had offered both economic and political supports. They have funded major developments such as schools, hospitals, and universities and roads as well. They annually send between 1.5 to $2 billion to Somalia. They also do fund some political campaigns that we are aware of, either through remittances or through directly to those that physically come and meet these communities here in the West. A classic example of that is the Minnesota Somali community, who are heavily invested in the economic and political affairs of Somalia. There are also numerous examples of direct investments, and that's presence of the diaspora in Somalia. We have the first president from the diaspora in Somalia right now. So I think collectively, the diaspora community have come with different experiences when it comes to their contribution of rebuilding Somalia. In rare cases, however, the diaspora community also continue to perpetuate inter-clan or interstate rivalries back home. In such unfortunate circumstances, they are depicted as hardliners who are unwilling to accept compromises because the conflict is of low cost to them. As that happens, they have the opportunity to flee at any point in time with their foreign passports. I think in conclusion, I would say the role of the Somali diaspora had largely been positive, with the exception of very rare cases where they contribute to destruction and mayhem at best. Thank you, Mohammed.
Mohammed, want to add to what Bashir said, and actually one of the things that concerns me, especially when I see political leaders in Somalia who are taking extreme positions on are not willing to compromise for the sake of moving the political process forward, is that you see them with individuals who are actually based outside the country, even people who have been living in Somalia, but their families are living in Turkey or other countries. So the risk to them is little. I mean, if Somalia collapses, they will go home. They will go back to their families in Tanzania or in South Africa or in some cases Turkey. So that's something that is really alarming to me, is that they are not in the mood to compromise, and they are as soon as things collapse, like happened before, they will be the first ones out of the country, and will leave the country to the mess. The other thing I want to say is the community's investment. I mean, I've been traveling, especially the last 4 years. I've traveled to Somalia maybe more than a dozen times. I was in Mogadishu for months, and also in Puntland, Southwest, Somaliland. And to be honest with you, the diaspora contribution is significant. It's the lifeline of the country. A lot of the investments that you see, major projects, are financed by diaspora. And these are, I mean, we're talking about businesses owned by people of different backgrounds, different tribes, who are working together to build an economy. So I think their contributions have been more positive than negative. We have, of course, people who are involved in political issues who are, in most cases negative, but the economic side, the diaspora's contribution has been very positive and needed for the country to move forward. The final thing I want to say is, if you look at all the measurement, the metrics for Somalia's economy over the last 4 years, Somalia has made significant progress on financial management, on issues of economic development. You look at debt forgiveness, all kinds of different things. I'm not saying that this government is responsible for that. I think that would have happened with or without this government. I think the issue is the people are making progress. Things are moving forward. And unfortunately, we have the election season that leads to, people taking extreme positions, but eventually things will come back to normal, in my opinion.
Thank you very much. For the sake of time, we have two more questions. The first question is to Ambassador Schwartz, Mr. Faisal, and Ambassador Shin. And please make your comments very brief, as much as you can. Gulf states and Turkey continue to play a crucial role in the Horn of Africa, including in Somalia. They remain vested in terms of their investments in military installations, ports, economic aid, and so on. They have also been involved in conflict resolution efforts, such as Turkey's role in building Somali military capabilities and serving as even as far as negotiating between Somalia and Somaliland in 2013 to 2015. So the question is, beyond economic incentives, how would you characterize the contributions and impact of such countries with regards to conflict resolution and peacekeeping efforts in Somalia and the Horn of Africa?
I mean, limited to those areas, I'd say not much. I mean, Turkey would be the partial exception over the last few years, where they've trained these Eagle battalions, or I think at least 2,000 now. I think they've trained fairly well. They've been deployed. They have some capacity. But the Arab states, I don't see that they've done much. UAE, they trained the Puntland Maritime Police. They had a couple battalions that they had trained, and they had on a base in Moog. But they only reported to UAE. They weren't integrated into the SNA. And I think after relations with UAE were broken, I think those battalions just sort of disappeared into Somalia. I don't know what became of them once their funding ceased and the like. So I don't see that they've done, very much in that regard. At the end of the day, it's going to be up to Somali government leaders, and particularly federal leaders, to manage the country's foreign relations and to to navigate the various, demands and interests of other countries, in this case of the Gulf states, and to do it as successfully as possible. But it's sort of been an either or so far, and Somalis haven't really articulated a strong ability to represent the country in the country's national interest. So they've been picked on by the others.
I would just add there that I too don't see much evidence by the Gulf states as playing a particularly helpful role when it comes to a peaceful resolution of disputes. They throw a lot of money around, but they throw it around in their own self-interest, usually involving themselves with some of the federal states in Somalia. There have been occasions when the Gulf states have done something useful in the region. Qatar, for example, had forces on the border between Eritrea and Djibouti. I think that was a positive thing. You also had both the UAE and Saudi Arabia helping to negotiate an agreement or a stabilization of relations between Ethiopia and Eritrea. That was generally positive. So there are some examples of positive involvement by the Gulf states in the region, but I'm hard pressed to identify much in Somalia where it's been very positive. I find it more negative than positive. Steve mentioned the training of the Maritime Force. I'm not real familiar with that, but I gather that was generally positive. I don't know how successful it was, but that was a pretty modest engagement. And I would be very leery of what the Gulf states have done and will do in Somalia.
Ahmed, I'm glad you raised this question because it takes me to my opening remarks where I said that the leaders of Somalia need to craft their own state, and Ambassador Stephen really touched that. There is nobody who can reestablish Somalia outside the Somali leaders and Somali people. When the Arab states pump into money, it's not responding to Somali proposals or the government puts out a proposal. It's what the Gulf states want, and it's a project that the Gulf states would like to see in Somalia. In terms of Turkey, I think they had a positive thing going on for them for a while, that they captured the imagination of the Somali people, and that is in itself a capital when you want to have a diplomatic relationship with a country. So Turkey enjoyed that early. However, in my opinion, Turkey gets stuck in and around Mogadishu. It should have expanded its tentacles and have gone outside Mogadishu and even invest, as you said with the question, some sort of reconciliation between Somali groups. I think Turkey, because of its history with the Somalis, since the 16th century during Ahmed al-Ghazali, Ahmed Gurey, whom Somalis really associate their birth as a nation with, Turkey should have gotten out of this parsimony, giving it to Villa Somalia and helping Somalia restructure in many ways, including reestablishing some sort of mediation between the government, the federal government and the states, but at the same time also sometimes bringing social groups and civic groups together and people seeing Turkey doing a reconciliation program, which they haven't done, and I think they shortchanged us in that way.
Thank you.
If I may add, sorry, I know we are short of time. I think in most of these countries that are involved in Somalia, yes, they're not investing or they're not spending money out of love for Somalia or the construction of Somalia. I think what saddens me is when a country kind of directs your foreign policy or your relations with other countries because they are funding you. I think we have numerous examples of that. But in the case of Turkey, I think that is the only permanent, in my opinion, that was the only permanent thing when it comes to international community support outside of the region. I agree a little bit with Faisal Roble on the idea that they have centralized their investments to Mogadishu, but then we also need to acknowledge that Mogadishu is everything good or bad about Somalia, which is sad in itself. But then I think my fears and concerns lie in the countries that do want to direct or tell us on how we want to run our government or our country, Somalia, because they are funding dollars in the country.
Thank you.
Mohammed, I know we're running short on time. I just want to quickly say that I think it's more than Turkey and the Gulf states. I think one of the things we're seeing is gap, especially when it comes to the West, the US and the European Union countries, and they're, ceding the area to Turkey and to other governments. And with the US military withdrawal from Somalia, I think we may see increased Chinese and Russian participation in that area. China already has a base in Djibouti. They're heavily investing in the Horn of Africa. Somalia is part of their Road and Belt Initiative, and China could be the superpower that plays more active role in the region. Same thing with Russia. Russians have been very active, and they've been pushing more to reestablish their historical ties to the Horn of Africa. So it is on the West to decide what is in their policy, what's in their national security interest when it comes to Somalia. Somalia has learned one valuable lesson from past administration, especially this government, is the fact that interest matters. What is the interest of these governments? What is the interest of Somalia? And their relations with these governments have been transactional, including the relations with Gulf states. So I think that's something that we will continue to see, that the Gulf states activities will diminish, but you may see bigger power be actively involved in Somalia.
Mohammed, I just cannot resist it, but often I don't defend the US, but this time I would. I think America is a country of laws, and basically the dollars that you spend outside has some sort of scrutiny. You have a Congress that would like to see where pennies are spent, as opposed to countries like Turkey, where accountability is in the hands of the president. So I think if Somalia wants to capitalize on America's largesse, I think I would strongly advise that the politicians and leaders of Somalia also need to be accountable. You cannot just throw money when you know that that money is, as Kat was mentioning earlier, when you know that money is going to the pockets of politicians. And as Somalis, we know that most of the money that is sent to Somalia, like Turkey taking millions of dollars in a purse, doesn't get to projects. So I think you're right. America may not have been as kind as we would have liked in development projects outside the military. But I think the backstop is with Somalis to come up with a more transparent, more scrutinable kind of projects and programs, so that probably we can defend. At this point in time, money you taken to Somalia is probably largely thrown away, and that has been happening for a while.
Thank you so much, Mr. Faisal, and all of you for your comments. As promised, this is the last question. And given the theme of our program today is building and empowering Somali resilience, I want to ask Mr. Faisal, Mr. Mohammed, and Bashir our last question. Among the many challenges that Somalis face is the 4.5 system. We all know it is discriminatory among Somalis itself. We know it divides us. We know it won't lead us or lead Somalia to achieving democracy and becoming a united country. What can we do as Somalis to move forward from the 4.5 system?
Let me start, Mohammed. I think I agree with your assessment of the 4.5 system. It is discriminatory. It has really held back the political progress of Somalia. But I think the issue comes back to is, when can you, the idea was 2020 will be the year that Somalia has election where, one man, one vote, one person, one vote participation. But due to the security issues and due to the other problems we've talked about, it became less likely. So to get to the point where every citizen can vote and participate in the political progress, you need to have all the other things lined up. And unfortunately, Somalia is a country that is a failed state that is recovering from failed state. And it will take time, in my opinion, to get to that point. I think this would have been, this administration, especially the Formaggio administration, failed on this. They should have been, putting the country in a better position to have elections this year where everybody participates, at least a significant percentage of the population. They have not done that. As a result, we're back to 4.5 political process.
Mohammed, I think you started with the nomenclature of Somali resiliency, and probably in that also is sustainability of programs, and I've worked in several. I think the challenge we have in Somalia is we don't really, again, put things in a programmatic way. I think when we talk about our resilience, our sustainability, we don't really look at the indexes and indices that really guide us to, for instance, the city of Los Angeles is trying to meet a UN sustainability program, and it requires about 60 factors to weigh on, and that's what, how you measure where you fall in that. I think when it comes to resilience, we haven't done that. We know the Somali people are resilient, but we don't know how to measure our resilience. So I would recommend that we have to really start through the planning department that my friend Jamal leads, to come up with a resilience program that really have indices that shows, with respect to election, we have been saying that, but from day one, Farmacho walked into the office, no international donor really gave him a benchmark and timeline to monitor and ask him to show them where he is. We seem to be waking up. I think they should have cut the budget long time ago when they realized a year and a half into the process that the federal government was not providing timelines and benchmarks as to where and how he's going to meet the one man, one vote. By the second year, those of us who observe Somalia politics knew that there won't be one man, one vote. We knew that because you need population statistics, you need census, you need a lot of things to carry on one man, one vote. So I think there is a total collapse of accountability and transparency, both on the Somali side, but also on the funding side. I can only answer this question by saying, let's look forward, and with the next election and whatever comes the result, day one should be the day that we start, cataloging and registering how we're gonna meet the next 4 years one man, one vote. Thank you very much.
Hi, Mohammed. I agree with Mohammed Fatah that the 4.5 system has been inequitable across levels and regions. However, I think I also do agree with him that there are many premises that we need to get right in order to address that. And I think the first of that list would be a referendum across the country, or at least where there's peace, to do a constitutional review. That is the social construct that binds us all. And I think we need to take a hard look at that in many regions. Number two, I think an issue that would also be prerequisites to that, I think, would be security. We need to defeat the enemy Al-Shabaab because they are still controlling a large swath of Somalia's regions. We need to do that as soon as possible. Only then can we address the 4.5 system. It has originally been put together as a temporary solution. I think it may have worked for a little bit, but it's time we get rid of that. But to do that, I think we need to also address the other premises that are kind of prerequisites to solving that. The federal system or governance, I think, is a little bit perpetuating the 4.5. And only then when we address what type of governance or what type of federal system we choose, I think, as through a referendum, not through or by a group of collected old men or women or leaders or politicians, but a countrywide referendum. I think that is when we can address the issue of 4.5 and the inequity that is in it.
Thank you so much. Well, everyone, this concludes our program today. I want to thank all of you for joining us from wherever the world you are joining us. Special thanks to our distinguished panelists on both sessions for our conference today. Many thanks to our ACTRI team, and special thanks to Allison and Antoine for working behind the scenes to making sure that this program comes to us in a very smooth manner. Please visit our website for more content, to get access to this recording of this conference, and to also to get information about our research and our soon to be released research on the disengagement efforts in Somalia. I thank you all. Thank you to the ambassadors. Thank you, Faisal. Thank you, Kathy Zimmerman, Mr. Mohammed, Abdullah, and Ambassador Shin. We appreciate you, and thank you. You all have a wonderful day.